Hello, people of Earth. Oh, I have an antivirus message. Okay, I'm just gonna hit OK. So, this is kind of weird for me, personally. But I'm just gonna roll into it. So, I'm reading Virginia Woolf. And I know it's backwards for you, but I am so excited. This was a gift from one of my very, very, very dear friends. And I saw her today for the first time since early February, and it is now, my cat is playing with a toy, but it's now April, almost mid-April, April 10th. So she remembered when I brought up that I was becoming a fan of Virginia Woolf through Instagram, because my feed is currently just filled with poetry and prose and just random, scribblings of text, because I've been writing music. My feed has always been like that, but at this point it's super saturated with it. So yeah, I just really wanted to use this as an opportunity to finally check something off of my list of things I've been meaning to do, but I've been putting off because I am scared. So let's get into it. I'm hoping that this is like incentive for me to finish the book, because it can be really hard for me to finish books. I have like plenty of books that just all have bookmarks, just tons of bookmarks everywhere, because I just won't finish them. So life happens. I'm a very active person. I be going out. So anyway, I'm rambling. Let's go ahead and dive into my cat thinks it's a great opportunity to start playing with his toys. So alright. So this is Virginia Woolf, of course, a collection of early novels from 1915 to 1925. So we're going to be covering the Voyage out today, part of it, but coming up we have Night and Day, Jacob's Room, and Mrs. Dalloway. Okay, so let me get a little comfy, like this, and don't mind that, that's just a bunch of clothes that I have to donate, but it's kind of hard for me to let go of things sometimes, and finish books apparently. So overall it's really pretty. I like how simple it is. I guess it just looks like a normal book, right? But Voyage out. Okay. Chapter 1. Here's the thing, I really don't know what to expect, because I've only been reading snippets of things just from randomly taken from her books and writing, so I'm excited. Alright, I can't really see, hold on. Okay, chapter 1. As the streets that led from the Strand to the embankment are very narrow, it is better not to walk down them arm in arm. If you persist, lawyers, clerks will have to make flying leaps into the mud. Young lady typists will have to fidget behind you. In the streets of London, where beauty goes unregarded, eccentricity. Wow. Dyslexia makes life hard sometimes. It's like I hear it right in my head, and then my brain will just sometimes, I don't know. If you're dyslexic, maybe you know. If you have ADHD, maybe you know. Anyway, must pay the penalty, and it's better not to be very tall, to wear a long blue cloak, or to beat the air with your left hand. One afternoon in the beginning of October, when the traffic was becoming brisk, a tall man... Hold on. Yeah. Was becoming brisk. A tall man strode along the edge of the pavement with the lady on his arm. Angry glances stuck up upon their backs. The small, agitated figures, for in comparison with this couple, most people look small, decorated with fountain pens and burdened with dispatch boxes, had appointments to keep, and drew a weekly salary, so there was some reason for the unfriendly stare which was bestowed upon Mr. Ambrose's height and upon Mrs. Ambrose's cloak. But some enchantment had put both enchantment, I guess I could say that, I don't know, had put both man and woman beyond the reach of malice and unpopularity. In his case, one might guess from the moving lips that it was thought, and in hers from the eyes fixed stonily straight in front of her, at a level above the eyes of most, that it was sorrow. It was only by scorning all she met that she kept herself from tears, and the friction of people brushing past her was evidently painful. After watching the traffic on the embankment for a minute or two with a stoical gaze, she twitched her husband's sleeve, and they crossed between the swift discharge of motor cars. When they were safe on the further side, she gently withdrew her arm from his, allowing her mouth at the same time to relax, to tremble. Then tears rolled down, and leaning her elbows on the balustrade, I apologize. She shielded her face from the curious. Mr. Ambrose attempted consolation. He patted her shoulder, but she showed no signs of admitting him, and feeling it awkward to stand beside a grief that was greater than his, he crossed his arms behind him and took a turn along the pavement. The embankment juts out in angles here and there, like pulpits, instead of preachers. However, small boys occupy them, dangling string, dropping pebbles, or launching wads of paper for a cruise. With their sharp eye for eccentric. I'm going to have a riot. Eccentric. Right? How embarrassing. They were inclined to think Mr. Ambrose awful, but the quickest-witted cried, "Bluebeard," as he passed. In case they should proceed to tease his wife, Mr. Ambrose flourished his stick at them, upon which they decided that he was grotesque merely, and 4 instead of 1 cried, "Bluebeard," in chorus. Although Mr. Ambrose stood quite still, much longer than is natural, so he's saying it's abnormal for how still he was, the little boys let her be. Mrs. Ambrose, I'm sorry, I think I said Mr. Again, sorry. Someone is always looking into the river near Waterloo Bridge. A couple will stand there talking for half an hour on a fine afternoon. Most people, walking for pleasure, contemplate for 3 minutes, when, having compared the occasion with other occasions, or made some sentence, they pass on. Sometimes the flats and churches and hotels of Westminster are like the outlines of Constantinople in a mist. Sometimes the river is an opulent purple, sometimes mud-colored, sometimes sparkling blue like the sea. It is always worth while to look down and see what is happening. But this lady looked neither up nor down. The only thing she had seen since she stood there was a circular iridescent patch slowly floating past with a straw in the middle of it. The straw and the patch swam again and again behind the tremulous medium of a great welling tear, and the tear rose and fell and dropped into the river. Then there struck close upon her ears, "Lars Porsena of Colosseum, by the 9 gods he swore," and then more faintly, as if the speaker had passed her on his walk, that the great house of Tarquin should suffer wrong no more. Now, I could have butchered all of that. Very great possibility that I did. But we're all here practicing reading aloud, you know. In my head, I'm sure it's pronounced right. But when I say it, well, you've seen what happens. Yes, she knew She must go back to all that, but at present she must weep. Screening her face, she sobbed more steadily than she had yet done, her shoulders rising and falling with great regularity. In this figure that her husband saw when, having reached the polished Sphinx, having entangled himself with a man selling picture postcards, he turned. The stanza instantly stopped. He came up to her, laid his hand on her shoulder, and said, "Dearest." His voice was supplicating, but she shut her face away from him, as much as to say, "You can't possibly understand." As he did not leave her, however, she had to wipe her eyes, and to raise them to the level of the factory chimneys on the other bank. She saw also the arches of Waterloo Bridge, and the carts moving across them, like the line of animals in a shooting gallery. They were seen blankly, but to see anything was of course to end her weeping and begin to walk. "I would rather walk," she said, her husband having hailed a cab already occupied by 2 city men. The fixity of her mood was broken by the action of walking. The shooting motor cars, more like spiders in the moon than terrestrial objects, the thundering drays, the jingling hansoms, and little black brogans. What the heck is a brogam? If anyone knows, please let me know. Made her think of the world she lived in. Somewhere up there above the pinnacles, where the smoke rose in a pointed hill, her children were now asking for her, and getting a soothing reply. As for the massive streets, squares, and public buildings which parted them, she felt at this moment how little London had done to make her love it, although 30 of her 40 years had been spent in a street. She knew how to read the people who were passing her. There were the rich who were running to and from each other's houses at this hour. There were the bigoted workers driving in a straight line to their offices. There were the poor who were unhappy and rightly malignant. Malignant. Oh God, I'm just embarrassing myself, but I'm having so much fun. Already, though, there were sunlit in the haze, tattered old men and women were nodding off to sleep upon the seats. When one gave up seeing the beauty that clothed things, this was the skeleton beneath. When one gave up seeing the beauty that clothed things, this was the skeleton beneath. I see. A fine rain now made her still more dimsel. Vans with the odd names of those enraged in odd industries. Sprules, S-P-R-U-L-E-S, manufacturer of sawdust. Grab, to whom no piece of waste paper comment comes amiss, fell flat as a bad joke. Bold lovers, sheltered behind one cloak, seemed to her sordid past their passion. The flower women, a contented company, whose talk is always worth hearing, were gauden hags. The red, yellow, and blue flowers, which heads were pressed together, would not blaze. Moreover, her husband, walking with a quick rhythmic stride, jerking his free hand, occasionally was either a Viking or a stricken Nelson. The seagulls had changed his note. "Ridley, shall we drive? Shall we drive, Ridley?" Mrs. Ambrose had to speak sharply. By this time he was far away. The cab, by trotting steadily along the same road, soon withdrew them from the West End, and plunged them into London. It appeared that this was a great manufacturing place, where the people were engaged in making things, as though the West End, with its electric lamps, its vast plate-glass windows all shining yellow, its carefully finished houses, and tiny live figures trotting on the pavement, or bowled along along on wheels in the road, was the finished work. It appeared to her a very small bit of work for such an enormous factory to have made. For some reason it appeared to her as a small golden tassel on the edge of a vast black cloak. Observing that they passed no other hansom cab, but only vans and wagons, and that none of the 1,000 men and women she saw was either a gentleman or a lady, Mrs. Ambrose understood that after all it is the ordinary thing to be poor, and that London is the city of the innumerable poor people. Startled by this discovery and seeing herself pacing a circle all the days of her life around Piccadilly Circus, she was greatly relieved to pass a building put up by the London County Council for night schools. We got some tea at the night school, perhaps? Lord, how gloomy it is, her husband groaned. Poor creatures. What with the misery for her children, the poor, and the rain? What with the miscry for her children, the poor, and the rain, her mind was like a wound exposed to the dry in the air. At this point, the cab stopped, for it was in danger of being crushed like an egg shell. The wide embankment, which had room for cannonballs and squadrons, had now shrunk to a cobble lane, steaming with smells of malt and oil blocked by wagons. While her husband read the place cards pasted on the brick announcing the hours at which certain ships would sail for Scotland, Mrs. Ambrose did her best to find information from a world exclusively occupied in feeding wagons with sacks half obliterated too in a fine yellow fog. They got neither help nor attention. It seemed a miracle when an old man approached, guessed their condition, and proposed to row them out to their ship in the little boat which he kept moored at the bottom of the flight of steps. With some hesitation, they trusted themselves to him, took their places, and were soon waving up and down the water. London, having shrunk to two lines of buildings on either side of them, square buildings and oblong buildings placed in rows like a child's avenues of bricks. The river, which had a certain amount of troubled yellow light in it, ran with great force. Bulky barges floated down swiftly, escorted by tugs. Police boats shot past everything. The wind went with the current. The open rowing boat in which they sat bobbed and curtsied, oh, I love that, across the line of traffic. In midstream, the old man stayed his hands upon the oars, and as the water rushed past them, remarked that once he had taken many passengers across, where now he took scarcely any. He seemed to recall an age when his boat, moored among the rushes, carried delicate feet across the lawns at Rotherhithe. They want bridges now, he said, indicating the monstrous outline of the Tower Bridge. Mournfully, Helen regarded him, who was putting water between her and her children. Mournfully, she gazed at the ship they were approaching, anchored in the middle of the stream. They could dimly read her name. Euphosine. There's no R. Yes, there is. Euphosine. Okay, well, if Europa is pronounced like that, oh shoot, my poor neighbor. Euphrosyne. Move on. Very dimly in the falling dusk, they could see the lines of the rigging, the mast, and the dark flag, which the breeze blew out squarely behind. As the little boat sidled up to the steamer, and the old man shipped his oars, he remarked once more, pointing above, the ships all over the world flew the flag the day they sailed. Flew that flag in particular. Okay, it was a painting above one of the ships. In the minds of both the passengers, the blue flag appeared a sinister token, and this the moment for presentiments. Yes, presentiments. In this the moment for but nevertheless they rose, gathered their things together, and climbed on deck. Now, at this point, I'm sure you're judging me, but you know what? I have to practice. In my head, I can make sense of it, and then that's just kind of what my condition is. Down in the saloon of her father's ship, Miss Rachel Vinrace, aged 24. Oh, me too. That's me. I'm Rachel Vinrace. Let's see what happens to her. Stood waiting her uncle and aunt nervously. To begin with, though nearly related, she scarcely remembered them. To go on with, they were elderly people, and finally, as her father's daughter, she must be in some sort prepared to entertain them. She looked forward to seeing them as civilized people generally look forward to the first sight of civilized people. his forehead to be kissed. His niece instinctively liked his chin, his thin, angular body, and the big head with its sweeping features and the acute, innocent eyes. "Tell Mr. Pepper," Roger bade the servant. "Yes, honey." "Hi, sweetie. Hi, honey. Okay. Okay, bed. Gonna have a cat break. Even though I'm only on page freaking 6 and it's 22 minutes already. Shh, 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 honey. Shh, 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 shh. Okay. So niece is feeling like Mr. Ambrose is approachable and she's intimidated by Mrs. Ambrose. But I really relate to Miss Rachel here, Miss Finrace. For some reason I would get really uncomfortable too. With dealing with people who were like not in my age group, but even within my age group, I was really selective. But it's nothing that ever bothered me, but with adults it did. I think because I'm always trying to impress. I'm always trying to make a good impression, so it stresses me out. Anyway, so Rachel, how do you do? Okay, whatever. "Tell Mr. Pepper," Rachel bade the servant. Husband and wife then sat down on one side of the table, while their niece opposite them. "My father told me to begin," she explained. "He's very busy with the men. You know Mr. Pepper, a little man who is bent as some trees are." Gooby. What can I help you with, dear? Communicate? Come here. What's up? You just want me to pet you. The hour is late. It is the hour of the Zoom meeting. Okay. So, she's notioning, whatever, to Mr. Pepper, that he should know. She's hoping for a little lead here. "A little man who was bent as some trees are by a gale on one side of the mat slipped in. Nodding to Mr. Ambrose, he shook hands with Helen." Okay, so he's got scoliosis, I suppose. "Droughts," he said, erecting the collar of his coat. "You are still rheumatic?" asked Helen. Her voice was low and seductive, though she spoke absently enough, the sight of the town and the river being still present to her mind. "Once rheumatic, always rheumatic, right? I'm hoping I'm saying that right. I fear," he replied. "To some extent it depends on the weather, though not so much as people are apt to think. One does not die of it, at any rate," said Helen. "As a general rule, no," said Mr. Pepper. "Soup, Uncle Riley?" asked Rachel. "Thank you, dear," he said, and as he held his plate out, sighed audibly. "Ah, she's not like her mother." Helen was just too late in thumping her tumbler on the table to prevent Rachel from hearing, and from blushing scarlet with embarrassment. "The way servants treat flowers," she said hastily. She drew a green vase with a crinkled lip toward her and began pulling out of the tight little chrysanthemums. Yes, those are beautiful flowers, which she laid on the tablecloth, arranging them fastidiously side by side. So she's like, when she's nervous, it seems like she organizes things and fidgets with things. There was a pause. "You knew Jenkinson, didn't you, Ambrose?" said Mr. Pepper across the table. "Jenkinson of Peterhouse?" "He's dead," said Mr. Pepper. "Oh dear. I knew him ages ago," said Ridley. "He was the hero of the pond accident, you remember? A queer card. Married a young man out of a So someone who sells tobacco and lived in the fens. Never heard of what became of him. Drink, drugs, said Mr. Pepper with sinister conciseness. He left a commentary. Hopeless middle, I'm told. The man had really great abilities, said Red. Cats. His introduction to Jellyby holds its own still, went on Mr. Pepper, which is surprising, seeing how textbooks change. There was a theory about the planets, wasn't there? Asked Ridley. A screw loose somewhere, no doubt about it, said Mr. Pepper, shaking his head. Now a trimmer ran through the table, and a light outside swerved. Okay, so time is passing. At the same time, an electric bell rang sharply again and again. Oh no, a car is approaching. We're off, said Ridley. A slight but perceptible wave seemed to roll beneath the floor. Then it sank. Then another came, more perceptible. Light slid across the uncurtained window. The ship gave a loud, melancholy moan. Oh, the ship is taking off. Okay. We're off, said Mr. Pepper. Other ships, as said she, answered her outside on the river. The chuckling and hissing of water could be plainly heard, and the ship heaved so that the steward bringing plates had to balance himself as he drew the curtain. There was a pause. Jenkinson of Cats, do you still keep up with him? Asked Ambrose. As much as one ever does, said Mr. Pepper. We meet annually. This year he has had the misfortune to lose his wife, which made it painful, of course. Very painful, Ridley agreed. There's an unmarried daughter who keeps house for him, I believe, but it's never the same, not at his age. Both gentlemen nodded sagely as they carved their apples. Oh, apples sound so good right now. I have one apple left. One. There was a book, wasn't there? Ridley inquired. There was a book, but there never will be a book, said Mr. Pepper with such fierceness that both ladies looked up at him. There never will be a book because someone else has written it for him, said Mr. Pepper with considerable acidity. That's what comes of putting things off and collecting fossils and sticking Norman arches on one's pig's ties. I confess I sympathize, said Ridley with a melancholy sigh. I have a weakness for people who can't begin. The accumulations of a lifetime wasted, continued Mr. Pepper. He had accumulations enough to fill a barn. It's vice that some of us escape, said Mr. Ridley. Our friend Miles has another workout today. Mr. Pepper gave an acid little laugh. According to my calculations, he said, he has produced 2 volumes and a half annually, which, allowing for time spent in the cradle and so forth, shows a commendable industry. Yes, the old master's saying of him has been pretty well realized, said Ridley. Away they had, said Mr. Pepper. You know the Bruce collection? Not for publication, of course. I should suppose not, said Ridley significantly. For a divine he was remarkably free. So I don't know if he means free time or if he's free-spirited. The Pump in Neville's Row, for example, inquired Mr. Pepper. Precisely, said Ambrose. Each of the ladies, being after the fashion of their sex, highly trained in promoting men's talk without listening to it, could think about the education of children, about the use of fog sirens in an opera, without betraying herself. Only it struck Helen that Rachel was perhaps too still for a hostess, and that she might have done something with her hands. Perhaps, she said at length, upon which they rose and left, vaguely to the surprise of the gentlemen, who had either thought them attentive or had forgotten their presence. One could tell strange stories of the old days, they heard Ridley say as he sank into his chair again. Glancing back at the doorway, they saw Mr. Pepper as though he had suddenly loosened his clothes. Yes, and had become a vivacious and malicious old ape. Oh my God. Mr. Pepper, Winding veils around their heads, the women walked on deck. They were now moving steadily down the river, passing the dark shapes of ships at anchor, and London was a swarm of lights with a pale yellow canopy drooping above it. There were the lights of the great theatres, the lights of the long streets, lights that indicated huge squares of domestic comfort, lights that hung high in the air. No darkness would ever settle upon those lamps, as no darkness had settled upon them for hundreds of years. It seemed dreadful that the town should blaze forever in the beholding it as a circumscribed mound. I'm going to read that again. It seemed dreadful that the town should blaze forever in the same spot, dreadful at least to people going away to adventure upon the sea, and beholding it as a circumscribed mound, eternally burnt, eternally scarred. Damn, she does not like London. From the deck of the ship, the great city appeared a crouched and cowardly figure, a sedentary miser. Leaning over the rail, side by side, Helen said, "Won't you be cold?" Rachel replied, "No." How beautiful. She added a moment later, very little was visible. A few masts, a shadow of land here, a line of brilliant windows there. They tried to make head against the wind. "It blows! It blows!" gasped Rachel. The words rammed down her throat. Struggling by her side, Helen was suddenly overcome by the spirit of movement, and pushed along with her skirts wrapping themselves around her knees, and both arms to her hair. But slowly the intoxication of movement died down, and the wind became rough and chilly. They looked through a chink in the blind, and saw that the long cigars were being smoked in the dining room. They saw Mr. Ambrose throw himself violently against the back of his chair, while Mr. Pepper crinkled his cheeks as though they had been cut in wood. I see, so he's smiling, laughing, they're having a good time. The ghost of a roar of laughter came out to them. The ghost of a roar of laughter came out to them, and was drowned at once in the wind. In the dry yellow lighted room, Mr. Pepper and Mr. Ambrose were oblivious of all tumult. They were in Cambridge, and it was probably about the year 1875. I love that word. I don't know what it means, but I'm gonna look it up. Excuse me while I look up this freaking word. Oh, so it's like loud, tumult of all tumult. Hold on. A loud confessed noise, especially when by constant noise. So they're okay. So they're oblivious to the noise. Okay. "They're old friends," said Helen, smiling at the sight. "Now, is there a room for us to sit in?" Okay. Rachel opened a door. "It's more like a landing than a room," she said. Indeed, it had nothing of the shut, stationary character of a room on shore. A table was rooted in the middle, and seats were stuck to the sides. Happily, the tropical suns had bleached the tapestries to faded blue-green color, and the mirror, with its frame of shells, the work of the steward's love, when the time hung heavy in the southern seas, was quaint rather than ugly. Twisted shells with red lips like unicorns' horns ornamented the mantelpiece. So he's into Odysseus too. I've got all his pamphlets, she said, little pamphlets, little yellow books. It did not appear that she had read them. Has he ever been in love? Asked Helen, who had chosen a seat. This was unexpectedly to the point. His heart's a piece of old shoe leather, Rachel declared, dropping the fish, but when she questioned, she had to own that she had never asked him. I shall ask him, said Helen. The last time I saw you, you were buying a piano, she continued. Do you remember? The piano, the room in the attic, and the great plants with the prickles? Yes, and my aunt said the piano would come through the floor, but at their age, one wouldn't mind being killed in the night. Dang. I mean, depends on how old they are, I guess. Especially in this time period. I mean, medicine was alright, but not the best. I heard from Aunt Bessie not long ago, Helen stated. She is afraid that you will spoil your arms if you insist upon so much practicing. The muscles of the forearm, and then one won't marry. She didn't put it quite like that, replied Mrs. Ambrose. Oh no, of course she wouldn't, said Rachel with a sigh. Helen looked at her. Her face was weak rather than decided, save from insipidity by the large inquiring eyes. Denied beauty, now that she was sheltered indoors, by the lack of color and definite outline. More cover, a hesitation in speaking, or rather a tendency to use the wrong words, made her seem more than normally incompetent for her years. Ain't it the truth? Mrs. Ambrose, who had been speaking much at random, now reflected that she certainly did not look forward to the intimacy of 3 or 4 weeks on board ship, which was threatened. Women of her own age usually boring her. She supposed that girls would be worse. She glanced at Rachel again. Yes, how clear it was that she would be vacillating, emotional, and when you said something to her, it would make no more lasting impression than the stroke of a stick upon water. There was nothing to take hold of in girls, nothing hard, permanent, satisfactory. Did Willoughby say 3 weeks, or did he say 4? She tried to remember. At this point, however, the door opened, and a tall, burly man entered the room, came forward, and shook Helen's hand with an emotional kind of heartiness. Willoughby himself, Rachel's father, Helen's brother-in-law. As a great deal of flesh would have been needed to make a fat man of him, his frame being so large. He was not fat. His face was large, framework too, looking, by the smallness of the features and the glow in the hollow of the cheek, more fitted to withstand assaults of the weather than to express sentiments and emotions, or to respond to them in others. It is a great pleasure that you have come, he said, for both of us. Rachel murmured in obedience to her father's glance. We'll do our best to make you comfortable, and Ridley, we think it an honor to have charge of him. Pepper will have someone to contract. Yes, Pepper will have someone to contradict him, which I daren't do. You find this child grown, don't you? A woman, eh? Still holding Helen's hand, he drew his arms around Rachel's shoulder, thus making them come uncomfortably close. But Helen forebore to look. You think she does us credit? He asked. Oh, yes, said Helen, because we expect great things of her. He continued, squeezing his daughter's arm and releasing her. But about you now. Okay, fascinating. So, yes, okay, so it makes sense for her to, make things perfect when she's nervous, because it seems like her parents might be like perfectionists or hold her to a really high standard. And if she doesn't do something perfect, probably they are probably hard on her. That's my guess. That's my assumption here. I'm using context clues. We'll see. I might end this soon because I have leftover ramen in the fridge and I can't stop thinking about the leftover ramen. So, focus. So, we expect great things of her, he continued, squeezing his daughter's arm and releasing her. But about you now. They sat down side by side on the little sofa. Do you leave the children well? They'll be ready for school, I suppose. Do they take after you or Ambrose? They've got good heads on their shoulders. I'll be bound. At this, Helen immediately brightened more than she had yet done, and explained that her son was 6 and daughter 10. Everybody said that her boy minute had taken the part of butter in his fingers, run across the room with it, and put it on fire, merely for the fun of the thing, a feeling which she could understand. And you had to show the young rascal that these tricks wouldn't do, eh? A child of 6. I don't think they matter. I'm an old-fashioned father. Nonsense, Willoughby. Rachel knows better. Much as Willoughby would doubtless have liked his daughter to praise him, she did not. Her eyes were unreflecting as water, her fingers still toying with the fossilized fish, her mind absent. The elder people went on to speak of arrangements that could be made for Ridley's comfort. A table placed where he couldn't help looking at the sea, far from boilers, at the same time sheltered from the view of people passing. Unless he made this a holiday, when his books were all packed, he would have no holiday whatever. For out at Santa Marina, Helen knew, by experience, that he would work all day. His boxes, she said, were packed with books. Leave it to me, said Willoughby, obviously intending to do much more than she asked of him. But Ridley and Mr. Pepper were heard fumbling at the door. How are you, Vinrace? Said Ridley, extending a limp hand as he came in, as though the meeting was melancholy to both on the whole more so to him. Willoughby preserved his heartiness, tempered by respect. For the moment nothing was said. We looked in and saw you laughing, Helen remarked. Mr. Pepper had just told a very good story. Psh! None of the stories were good, said her husband peevishly. Still a severe judge, Ridley? Inquired Mr. Vinrace. We bored you so that you left, said Ridley, speaking directly to his wife. As this was quite true, Helen did not attempt to deny it, and her next remark, but didn't they improve after we'd gone, was unfortunate, for her husband answered with a droop of his shoulders, if possibly they got worse. The situation was now one of considerable discomfort for everyone concerned, as was proved by a long interval of constraint and silence. Mr. Pepper indeed created a diversion of a kind by leaping onto his seat, both feet tucked under him, with the action of a spinster who detects a mouse, as the draught struck at his ankles. Drawn up there, sucking at his cigar, with his arms encircling his knees, he looked like the image of Buddha, and away from this elevation began a discourse, addressed to nobody, for nobody had called for it, upon the unplumbed depths of the ocean. He professed himself surprised to learn that although Mr. Vinrace possessed 10 ships, regularly plying between London and Buenos Aires, none of them was bidden to investigate the great white monsters of the lower waters. That was a mouthful for me. No, laughed Willoughby. The monsters of the earth are too many for me. Rachel was heard to sigh. Poor little goats. If it weren't for the goats, there'd be no music, my dear. Music depends upon goats, said her father rather sharply, and Mr. Pepper went on to describe the white, hairless, blind monsters lying curled on the ridges of the sand of the sea, at the bottom of the sea. So there's goats at the bottom of the sea, which would explode if you brought them to the surface, their sides bursting asunder and scattering entrails to the wind, which, when released from pressure, with considerable detail, with such show of knowledge, that Ridley was disgusted and begged him to stop. From all this, Helen drew her own conclusions, which were gloomy enough. Pepper was a bore. Rachel was an unlicked girl, no doubt prolific of confidences, the very first of which would be, "You see, I don't get on with my father." Willoughby, as usual, loved his business and built his empire. Between them all, she could be considerably bored. Being a woman of action, however, she rose, and she said that for her part, she was going to bed. At the door she glanced back instinctively at Rachel, expecting that as the two of the same sex, they would leave the room together. Rachel rose, looked vaguely into Helen's face, and remarked with her slight stammer, "I'm going out to triumph in the wind." Mrs. Ambrose's worst suspicions were confirmed. She went down the passage, lurching from side to side, and fending off the wall now with her right arm, now with her left. At each lurch she explained empathically, "Damn!" So she's having a hard time. She's not liking this boat. But she's trying to keep it together. Our girl Rachel. She's got a controlling father, it seems. Alright, let's see. We're at 49:51. And let me see if I can see what chapter 2 is. Chapter 2. Okay. I'll keep going. I'm enjoying this. Uncomfortable as the night, with its rocking movement and salt smells, may have been, and in one case undoubtedly was, for Mr. Pepper had insufficient clothes upon his bed. The breakfast next morning wore a kind of beauty. The voyage had begun, and had begun happily in a soft blue sky and a calm sea. The sense of untapped resources, things to say as yet unsaid, made the hour significant. Things to say as yet unsaid made the hour significant, so that in future years the entire journey perhaps would be represented by this one scene, with the sound of sirens hooting in the river the night before somehow mixing in. Scratching post. The table was cheerful with apples and bread and eggs. Helen handed Willoughby the butter, and as she did so cast her eye on him and reflected, "And she married you, and she was happy, I suppose." She went off on a familiar train of thought, leading to all kinds of well-known reflections, from the old wonder why Teresa had married Willoughby. Of course, one sees all that, she thought, meaning that one sees that he's big and burly and has a great booming voice and a fist and a will of his own. But here she slipped into a fine analysis of him, which is better represented by one word: sentimental, by which she meant that she was never simple and honest about his feelings. For example, he seldom spoke of the dead, but kept anniversaries with singular pomp. She suspected him of nameless atrocities, which, with regard to his daughter, as indeed she had always suspected him of bullying his wife. I see, so she's gossiping. Naturally, she felt to comparing her own fortunes with the fortunes of her friend, for Willoughby's wife had been perhaps the one woman Helen called friend. So she would know. And this comparison often made the staple of their talk. Ridley was a scholar, and Willoughby was a man of business. Ridley was bringing out the 3rd volume of Pindar when Willoughby was launching his first ship. They built a new factory the very year the commentary of Aristotle on Aristotle, appeared on the university press. And Rachel, she looked at her, meaning no doubt to decide the argument, which was otherwise too evenly balanced, by declaring that Rachel was not comparable to her own children. She really might be 6 years old, was all she said. However, this judgment referred to the smooth, unmarked outline of the girl's face, and not condemning her otherwise, for if Rachel were ever to think, feel, laugh, or express herself, instead of dropping milk from a height as though to see what kind of drops it made, she might be interesting, though never exactly pretty. She was like her mother, as the image in a pool on a still summer's day is like the vivid, flushed face that hangs over it. Dang, man. Anyhow, he had done good work in India, and there was nothing to regret in his life except the fundamental defects which no wise man regrets, when the present is still his. So concluding, he looked up suddenly and smiled. Rachel caught his eye. And now you've chewed something 37 times, I suppose, she thought, but said politely aloud, "Are your legs troubling you today, Mr. Pepper?" "My shoulder blades," he asked, shifting them blamefully. "Beauty has no effect upon uric acid that I'm aware of." He sighed, contemplating the round pane opposite, through which the sky and sea showed blue. At the same time, he took a little parchment volume from his pocket and laid it on the table, as it was clear that he invited comment. Helen asked him the name of it. She caught the name, but she caught also a disquisition upon the proper method of making roads, beginning with the Greeks, who had, he said, many difficulties to contend with. He continued with the Romans, passed to England, and the right method, which speedily became the wrong method, and wound up with such a fury of denunciation directed against the road makers of the present day in general. Okay, and the road makers of Richmond Park in particular, where Mr. Pepper had the habit of cycling every morning before breakfast, that the spoons fairly jingled against the coffee cups, and the insides of at least 4 rows mounted in a heap beside Mr. Pepper's plate. "Pebbles," he concluded, viciously dropping another bread pellet upon the heap. "The roads of England are mended with pebbles. With the first heavy rainfall, I've told him, your road will be a swamp. Again and again my words have proved true. But do you suppose they listen to me when I tell them so? When I point out the consequences of the public purse? When I recommend him to read Corphasis? No, Mrs. Ambrose, you will form no just opinion of the stupidity of mankind until you have sat upon a borough council." The little man fixed her with a glance of ferocious energy. "I have had servants," said Mrs. Ambrose, concentrating her gaze. "At this moment I have a nurse. She's a good woman as they go, but she's determined to make my children pray. So far, owing to great care on my part, they think of God as a kind of walrus. But now that my back's turned, Ridley," she demanded, swinging a palm round upon her husband, "what shall we do if we find them saying the Lord's Prayer when we get home again?" Ridley made the sound which is represented by tush, but Willoughby, whose discomfort as he listened was manifested by a slight movement and rocking of his body, said awkwardly, "Oh, surely, Ellen, a little religion hurts nobody." "I would rather my children told lies," she replied, and while Willoughby was reflecting that his sister-in-law was even more eccentric than he remembered, pushed her chair back and swept upstairs. In a second they heard her calling back, "Oh, look, we're out at sea." They followed her to the deck. All the smoke in the house had disappeared, and the ship was out in a wide space of sea, very fresh and clear, pale in the early light. They had left London sitting on its mud, a very thin line of shadow tapered on the horizon, scarcely thick enough to stand the burden of Paris, which nevertheless rested upon it. They were free of roads, free of mankind, and the same exhilaration of their freedom ran through them all. The ship was making her way steadily through small waves, which flapped her and then frizzled like effervescing water, leaving a little border of bubbles and foam on either side. The colorless October sky above was thinly clouded as if by the trail of wood-fire smoke, and the air was wonderfully salt and brisk. Beautiful. Indeed, it was too cold to stand still. Mrs. Ambrose drew her arm within her husband's as they moved off. It could be seen. Mrs. Ambrose drew her arm within her husband's, and as they moved off, it could be seen from the way in which her slopping cheek turned up to his that he had something private to communicate. They went a few paces, and Rachel saw them kiss. Down she looked into the depth of the sea, while it was slightly disturbed on the surface by the passage of "Here it goes again." Europersine. That's just what I'm going to say. It's EUPHROSYNE, so you make sense of that. Beneath it was green and dim, and it grew dimmer and dimmer until the sand at the bottom was only a pale blur. One could scarcely see the black ribs of wrecked ships or the spiral towers made by the burrowings of great eels, or the smooth green-sided monsters who came by flickering this way and that. And Rachel, if one wants me, I'm busy till 1, said her father, enforcing his words as he often did when he spoke to his daughter by a smart blow upon the shoulder. Until 1, she repeated, and you'll find yourself some employment, eh? Scales, French, a little German, eh? There's Mr. Pepper, who knows more about separable verbs than any man in Europe, huh? And he went off laughing. Rachel laughed too, as indeed she had laughed ever since she could remember, without thinking it funny, but because she admired her father. But just as she was turning with a view perhaps to finding some employment, she was intercepted by a woman who was so... She admires her father, so this could either mean she holds herself to a high standard, like Mrs. Ambrose is thinking, he's doing something to her, and she's, just feeling some type of way. So maybe it's unintentional, I don't know. I just need to keep reading. While I'm over here contemplating, I can just keep freaking reading. Okay. So she's fake laughing, I guess. But just as she was turning with a view, perhaps to finding some employment, she was intercepted by a woman who was so broad and so thick that she had to be intercepted by her. That was so broad and so thick that to be intercepted by her was inevitable. The discreet, tentative way in which she moved together with her sober black dress showed that she belonged to the lower orders. Nevertheless, she took up a rock-like position, looking about her to see that no gentry were near before she delivered her message, which had reference to the state of the sheets and was at the utmost gravity. However we're to get through this voyage, Miss Rachel, I really can't tell. She began with a shake of her head. There's only just enough sheets to go round, and the master's has a rotten place you could put your fingers through. And the counterpanes. Did you notice the counterpanes? I thought to myself a poor person would have been ashamed of them. The one I gave Mr. Pepper was hardly fit to cover a dog. No, Miss Rachel, they could not be mended. They're only fit for dust sheets. Why, if one screwed one's finger to the bone, one would have to work undone the next time they went to the laundry. Her voice is an indignation wavered as if tears were near. Wow, words just are moving around on the page. Her voice in its indignation wavered as if tears were near. There was nothing for it but to descend and inspect a large pile of linen heaped upon a table. Mrs. Chailey handled the sheets as if she knew each by name, character, and constitution. Some had yellow stains, others had places where the threads made long ladders, but to the ordinary eye they looked much as sheets usually do look, very chill, white, cold, and irreproachably clean. Suddenly, Mrs. Chailey, turning from the subject of sheets, dismissing them entirely, clenched her fist on the top of them and proclaimed, "And you couldn't ask a living creature to sit where I sit." Mrs. Chailey was expected to sit in a cabin which was large enough, but too near the boiler, so that after 5 minutes she could hear her heart go. She complained, putting her hand above it, which is a state of things that Mrs. Vinrace, Rachel's mother, would never have dreamt of inflicting. Mrs. Vinrace, who knew every sheet in her house, and expected of every one of the best they could do, Mrs. Vinrace, who knew every sheet in her house, and expected of every one the best they could do, but no more. It was the easiest thing in the world to grant another room, and the problem of sheets simultaneously and miraculously solved itself, the spots and ladders not being past cure after all. But lies, 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 explained the mistress indignantly as she ran up onto the deck. What's the use of telling me lies? In the anger that a woman of 50 should behave like a child and come cringing to a girl because she wanted to sit where she had not leave to sit, she did not think of the particular case, and, unpacking her music, soon forgot all about the old woman and her sheets. Mrs. Chailey folded her sheets, but her expression testified to flatness within. The world no longer cared about her, and a ship was not a home. When the lamps were lit yesterday and the sailors went tumbling above her head, she had cried, She would cry this evening, she would cry tomorrow. It was not the home. Meanwhile, she arranged her ornaments in the room, which had won too easily. They were strange ornaments to bring on a sea voyage. China pugs, tea sets, and miniature cups stamped floridly with the arms of the city of Bristol, hairpin boxes crusted with shamrock antelopes, crusted with shamrock antelope, no, there's a call. God, how many more? I gotta make it through. I can make it through. Okay, I might stop soon, because, oh, goodness. Oh, yes, it's been an hour. Okay, I'll finish this page. So, we're getting to know Mrs. Chaley, okay? Shamrocks, okay? So she's an immigrant. But there was one portrait in a gilt frame for which a woman holding white babies, but there was one portrait in a gilt frame for which a nail was needed. And before she saw it, Mrs. Chaley put on her spectacles and read what was written on a slip of paper at the back. Can you please give me a moment? Can I just have one moment? Okay, thank you. This picture of her mistress is given to Emma Chaley. By Willoughby Vinray. Okay, so my cats are no longer letting me finish this video, so we'll stop there. I'm going to use this cute Polaroid of my best friend as a bookmark. Alright guys, so we are not very far in, so this is going to be a long ride. And if people watch it, great. If not, oh well. This is just going to be on the internet forever.